For the past month or two, we've been going through Genesis chapter by chapter in a lot of cases. And here we are in Genesis chapter 16. And we've been studying about the life of Abraham, how he was called out of Ur of Chaldees and Haran, and called out to a land that the Lord would show him. And he was given many promises. And we are studying about really Abram's journey through faith and his journey to understanding and seeing those promises realized. And Abraham's journey very much mirrors our own. We have been given promises as well, and we are taking a journey of faith until we see those promises realized as well. So we can learn a lot from the life of Abraham. And here we are in Genesis chapter 16, and we're talking about the incident of Sarai and Hagar this evening. Start reading with me in Genesis chapter 16, starting in verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, Now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go into my maid, perhaps I will obtain children through her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. After Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife took Hagar the Egyptian, her maid, and gave her to her husband Abram as wife. Now you see here in Genesis chapter 16 that we are looking at really an interesting story with Sarai and Hagar. It said that they had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan at this time. This would mean that Abram was about 85 years old. He was 75 years old when he left Haran. Now he's 85. And Sarai herself would be about 75, given what we know about their age difference, about 10 years. And so the biological clock is ticking on the promise of having a physical descendant. And Abram and Sarai are probably both feeling the pressure of that. And what complicates matters is that Sarai's womb is closed. She has not been able to bear children. And so Sarai begins to really show this plan that she's hatched to give Abram an offspring that is indeed from his own body. They know that much. God has told them that the heir of promise was to be from Abram's own body. And they're trying to figure out how in the world that would happen. And so this plot is hatched. And Sarai and Abram do, honestly, what we so often try to do. We take problems into our own hands and try to solve them for God. And this is what they're doing here. The logic is that since Sarai's womb is closed, that Abram can go into Sarai's maidservant Hagar, and that obtains what they think will be the solution to this problem, because it is a child that is A, still from Abram's flesh, as God has promised, and B, it still legally belongs to Sarai because it is her maidservant. And perhaps they saw themselves as cleverly figuring out God's puzzle, but that was not the case. This was them acting on behalf of God in a way that He had not told them to do. And so we see consequences from that, starting in verse 4. He went into Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. And Sarai said to Abram, May the wrong done me be upon you. I gave my maid into your arms, but when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, Behold, your maid is in your power. Do to her what is good in your sight. So Sarai treated her harshly, and she fled from her presence. So we see problems arise in the family of Abram. When Hagar conceived, it says that Sarai became despised in her eyes. Well, what does this mean? I take this to mean that Hagar looked down on Sarai because she had attained a level of worth that Sarai could not. After all, a woman's worth was based upon whether they could bear male children or not. And so when she has conceived, she has attained a level of worth that Sarai could not. And thus she looks down upon Sarai. And so we show that when we do it our way instead of God's way, things go bad, and things are bad here. A maidservant is usurping her mistress, her master in this case, in her attitude, and Sarai doesn't like it. And she complains to Abram, and Abram says, "Do to her what is good in your sight." And so Sarai treats her harshly, and Hagar flees from her presence. We have to consider the possibility that Abram and Sarai deal with this situation wrongfully towards Hagar. After all, it was their idea for this to happen in the first place, for Abram to conceive through Hagar. But we're not told in the text whether they deal with it right or not. We have to be open to the possibility, and really this is both sides of the argument. Hagar in a moment is going to be described as afflicted, and it said that Sarai treated her harshly and that Abram allowed her to do so, gave her the go-ahead to do so. And if Hagar is afflicted, it bears to ask, who are the afflictors? It could very well be Abram and Sarai. But on the other side of the argument, in a similar issue that is going to come up later, God tells Abram essentially that it's okay to cast out Hagar from among their midst. So I'm not really sure whether Abram and Sarai are in the wrong here or not to deal with Hagar the way that she is being dealt with. What I do know is that Hagar does flee from Sarai because of her harsh treatment, and she flees into the wilderness. Keep reading with me in verse 7. Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of the water in the wilderness, and by the spring on the way to Shur. He said, "Hagar, Sarai's maid, where have you come from, and where are you going?" And she said, "I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai, I'm fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai." Then the angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit yourself to her authority." Moreover, the angel of the Lord said to her, "I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they will be too many to count." The angel of the Lord further said to her, "Behold, you are with child, and you will bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He will be a wild donkey of a man, his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him, and he will live to the east of all his brothers." Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God who sees." For she said, "Have I even remained alive after seeing him?" Therefore the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son whom Hagar bore Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. The first thing that we see in this passage is the appearance of, for lack of a better term, a character that is going to show up multiple times throughout the Old Testament. And that is the angel of the Lord. This is the first time that the angel of the Lord is mentioned. And he will again be mentioned in Numbers and Judges and 2 Samuel and Zechariah, and may appear in some other places, especially later on in Genesis, maybe the same person. And it is possible that this angel of the Lord is Jesus, because it seems like he accepts worship in Judges chapter 13, something a servant of God, a true angel, would never do. But I do want to caution you that this is not to say that Jesus is an angel. He is not an angel in that sense of the word. John 1 and Colossians 1 make it very clear that Jesus is God and that Jesus was not a created being. However, this term angel here, malach in the Hebrew and angelos in the Greek, can mean simply just messenger. And so it's at least something that we have to think about, that this messenger of the Lord could be the Lord Himself in that way. Nevertheless, we do see Him appear multiple times, and He is, again, for lack of better terms, an important character in the Old Testament and appears at important times. The angel of the Lord comes to Hagar and finds her out in the wilderness, and she explains her situation. And his solution is return and submit. Return to your mistress and submit under her, and you will be blessed, is the general idea. And I can't help but think that the reason that the angel of the Lord says this is because her attitude was not right in the first place, that she was not submitting. In essence, you're not where you should be right now, and your attitude is not right toward your mistress. And if she does obey, if she does return, if she does submit, if she goes back into the fold of Abram, then she will be rewarded. And it talks about that reward, so to speak, when it says, I will multiply your descendants. This is a promise that we've seen given to Abram multiple times so far, at least twice by my counting, that his descendants would be as innumerable as the sand on the seashore or the stars in the sky. Well, here, this promise, so to speak, is given to Hagar. And I can't help but think that this is for Abram's sake, because Ishmael, the child in her womb, is indeed Abram's son. And so I see this as, once again, God taking care of all who are in Abram's fold. I mentioned in previous lessons how God is going to take care of those even who come into contact with Abram and treat him favorably or have some kind of relation to him. Lot would be one of those. But now it is extending to Hagar and Ishmael because of what they have done. We talked a moment ago about the problems that were in-house for Abram and Sarai and Hagar. But the in-house problems caused by this incident actually became worldwide. You'll notice that her child is Ishmael. Those of the Muslim faith consider themselves to be descendants of Ishmael, and they have vehemently opposed the Jews who consider themselves descendants of Abraham through Isaac. And so I find it interesting that Abram and Sarai unwittingly started a war that has lasted 1,000+ years by one action, by trying to do God's work for him, trying to solve God's problems for him. Now that's an interesting thought as we no longer have any more chapter to study, but the idea of solving God's problems for him. When we look at Abram and Sarai in this short story about them trying to understand the problem or understand the promise and the problems they faced from that, we understand that they were trying to work things out in their time, not in God's time. But can you imagine how they must have felt? Here Abram has been in the land for 10 years. 10 years they've been waiting for something that they were promised from God. Specifically an heir. Something that they had been waiting for even before God had promised it to them. And it doesn't come. We know from the rest of the story, that it's 25 years before Abram and Sarah have a child. Isaac. It takes 25 years. Abram is 100 years old. And Sarah 90 when they finally have Isaac. But I want to share with you tonight, as we kind of wrap this up, words of a hymn that I think are appropriate to what we have been talking about. Turn in your songbooks to 361. 361. Abram and Sarai in this particular incident needed somebody to remind them of the sentiment of this hymn. And we often need to be reminded of the sentiment of this hymn. That God works in His own time, and not that He makes things adequate, that He makes things passable, but that He makes all things beautiful in His time. Isn't that what the song says? In His time, He makes all things beautiful in His time. Lord, please show me every day as You're teaching me Your way that You do just what You say in Your time. Imagine if Abram and Sarai were reminded of that the Lord does just what He says in His time. Not their time, not their way of doing things, but in the Lord's way and in His time. Second verse, in Your time, You make all things beautiful in Your time. Lord, my life to You I bring. May each song I have to sing be to You a lovely thing in Your time. What beautiful words as we close this evening that those are. To remind us through this story that God has a plan for us. That God has made promises to us, as I said at the very beginning. And as we close this evening, I know it's not typical, but I'd like to lead this song that I've just picked out. We'll lead this song and then I'll offer a few closing thoughts. And then we will have our invitation song.